Chapter 18. Daisy. Daisy was content to stay with Lydia at her home while Gabriel dropped off his mother. No one seemed to think it odd that he'd left her here. I'm being paranoid again, she mused, deciding to make a concerted effort to worry less about what others thought of her. She wasn't her mother, and she'd seen how poisonous it could be to focus too much on negative thoughts. Above all, it was a waste of energy. Lydia stared out across the garden towards the beach before she began to speak again. I think I realized for the first time since running away from Lorenzo with Francesca how much long-term damage his infidelity had caused me when I watched you and Gabriel coping with your relationship. I knew it deep down, of course, which is why I've been so determined to see you and Gabriel find a way to work through your issues, Lydia said. Daisy swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She couldn't help thinking of her own mother and her wasted life waiting for Peter, who was never free to be with her. So many wasted lives, she said quietly. Why do people make choices to spite themselves, do you think? She asked, aware she'd almost done exactly the same thing. I have no idea, Lydia said. Foolish pride, most probably. None of us want to lose face or be humiliated. Daisy watched the beautiful lady she'd come to love and wished she could erase the hurt she'd suffered for far too long. Thank you for being so bossy with me and making me at least give Gabriel the chance to put things right. Bossy? Lydia laughed. I suppose I can be. But you're both well suited. I could tell the instant I saw you together that you felt about each other the same way Lorenzo and I had done when we were young. I couldn't bear to sit back and watch two people I was fond of make an unnecessary mistake. You and Gabriel didn't deserve to suffer because of a bad choice he'd made, and any preconceived ideas where you were concerned. You're right, Daisy said thoughtfully. I've spent too many years watching Mum suffering because of her choices with my dad after he walked out on her that time. I didn't want to have to go through the same thing. And that's completely understandable, Lydia said, giving her a hug. But you're clever enough to listen to advice and act on it. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Gabriel showed me the pictures he'd taken of your paintings, Lydia said. They're exceptionally good, you know. Daisy couldn't help smiling gratefully. Thank you. I wasn't sure I should have let him take the pictures, she said. He was so insistent. And I do know that I have to step out of my comfort zone if I want to eventually have the confidence to exhibit them somewhere. You were right to let him take the pictures, she said. Others should be allowed to appreciate your work. It would be a dreadful waste for them to be kept languishing in your room at the back of the hotel. They heard the low roar of Gabriel's Triumph stag. Daisy's heart contracted. He's back quickly, Lydia said, unable to hide her amusement. I suppose he didn't want to waste any of the time he could spend alone here with you. Daisy could feel the heat rising through her cheeks. Lydia smiled. I shouldn't tease. I enjoy the fact that two young people who I care so much about seem to be falling in love with each other. It brings out the romantic in me. In love? She didn't doubt for a second that her feelings towards Gabriel were exactly that. But could she dare to believe that he could feel as strongly towards her? She didn't have time to mull over the idea because seconds later Gabriel called out to them both and joined them back at the table. Lydia smiled. I think you gave your mother a lot to think about tonight, Gabriel, she said. Gabriel frowned. Do you think I should check if she's okay? He asked. He looked at Daisy while his grandmother mulled over this suggestion. No, darling, Lydia said. I think I should call your mother. I need to have a quick word with her anyway. Why don't you two enjoy the rest of this beautiful evening, and I'll catch up with you both in the morning. Without waiting for them to reply, she stood up, blew them both a kiss, and headed back inside. Neither of them spoke until Lydia had disappeared. Then Gabriel smiled at Daisy and said, "Did you get the impression she was trying to be subtle just then?" Daisy giggled. "Just a little." She wasn't sure what to say next. The thought of an entire evening ahead alone with Gabriel caused her stomach to flip over. Stay calm, she told herself. He looked a little uncertain. "What would you rather do?" he asked, leaning towards her slightly over the table, his eyes narrowed. "We could go for a walk again. The tide is fairly high, but it should be quiet at this time of night." "Sounds lovely," she said, picturing their stroll. "Or I could show you round the tower?" She could see he was trying to keep from smiling, but didn't quite manage to achieve a serious expression. She pretended to consider her options. "The beach," she said eventually, standing up. "It's a glorious evening, and we should make the most of this hot weather." She noticed his expression slip very slightly for a split second, only for him to smile and stand to take her hand. "Great idea," he said. Daisy enjoyed him being disappointed in her choice, but didn't want to appear too keen. They might have spent glorious nights together when they were in Asia, but they were on his home turf now, and she didn't want his grandmother to discover that she'd gone with him to the tower as soon as she'd turned her back. She breathed in the warm, salty air, enjoying the scent of tea roses and jasmine that she'd come to associate with this beautiful place. "I love it here so much," she said, not meaning to voice her thoughts aloud. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze and looked down at her, smiling. "I'm so pleased you're happy here," he said. "I want you to stay here, with me." He led her down the steps onto the beach, where the sand was warm and the lowering sun coloured the sky in the brightest oranges and golds Daisy thought she'd ever seen. "With you? He looked out across the gently rolling waves. "I probably shouldn't have said anything." She was glad he had. They came to the end of the small beach and turned a slight corner past a large rock. Daisy spotted an opening, and without giving herself time to think, pulled him with her into the dark recess. He opened his mouth to speak, but she reached up and pulled his head down so his lips met hers in a kiss. Gabriel let go of her hand and pulled her into his arms. Holding her tightly, he kissed her with a passion she'd fantasized about since leaving him behind in Asia. Daisy's heart pounded against his firm chest. He held her so tightly her body was almost crushed against his. She hoped she wouldn't wake up and discover that these delicious sensations were something from a dream. Unable to resist, she let one hand travel down his back, over his gorgeously tight bum. Gabriel froze for a second, and she thought he was holding his breath. Neither spoke. She drew her hand around between them and ran her fingers down the front of his trousers. "I don't want you to stop," he whispered hoarsely. "But if I have to walk back to the tower without being reported for indecency, then I think you'll have to." She moved back lightly and looked down to where her hand was resting on him. "Sorry," she fibbed. "I couldn't help myself." He cleared his throat. "Don't apologize. I'd love for you to carry on, but maybe we should do so somewhere a little more private." She let her hand drop. "I thought this was private, sort of." He kissed her cheek and lowered his voice. It is, to a degree. He motioned his head so she looked up over her left shoulder. But I don't want to give my Nan's elderly neighbour too much excitement for one evening. Daisy couldn't see anything apart from the edge of a house. What do you mean? He bent his knees so he was her height and pointed a little further to the left. The sunroom. Can you see it? She gasped. Sitting at the window, staring out to sea, was a wizened old man. You don't think he saw anything, do you? She asked, horrified. Put it this way, Gabriel said, trying not to laugh. When I spotted him a few moments ago, he wasn't as interested in the horizon as he now seems to be. Mortified, Daisy turned away. I'm so embarrassed. Gabriel hugged her tightly to him. Don't be silly, he soothed. She looked down at the bulge in his trousers. Maybe I should walk slightly in front of you, she said, unable to help laughing. Come along. I don't want to give that old guy anything more to think about. They made their way towards Lydia's garden as the sun set down behind the hills towards the west of the island. Just as they reached the steps, Gabriel hesitated. What's the matter? Daisy asked, noticing his troubled expression. I need to tell you something, he said. Her heart pounded. It had been such an exciting evening so far, she didn't think she could bear for him to disappoint her by confiding something that would ruin everything between them. Go on then, she said. He stared at her and then down at the sand for a few seconds. Then, taking a deep breath, he said, I showed the photos I took of your paintings to my grandmother. Was that it? Daisy smiled, relieved. I know. She told me. She was very complimentary too, which was lovely. He narrowed his eyes. I also showed my mother. She could sense there was more. Go on, she said warily. She loved them too, he said. She did. And what else? Because I can tell there's more. They've both agreed to hold an exhibition of your paintings at the hotel. He stared at her as she thought about this unexpected turn of events. She could see he was concerned about her reaction, but how could she be angry with someone who was making a dream of hers come true? Seriously. She almost held her breath, unable to believe what he'd just told her, picturing how her paintings would look hung on the pristine walls of the Encore. Gabriel's mouth drew back in a wide smile. Yes, of course, seriously, he laughed. How do you feel about it? She shrugged, trying to gauge how this news made her feel. Scared that people will see what an amateur I am? Embarrassed that they're not more professional? She tried to think of other things to add. But you don't mind? She squealed and jumped up and down a couple of times. Why would I mind? I'm delighted. She grabbed hold of him and kissed him. He took her in his arms and kissed her back with such force, she wondered if her lips would bruise. Not that she cared if they did. He kissed so beautifully, and she would happily spend the rest of her life wrapped in his arms with her lips pressed against his. He let go of her and took hold of her hand. I'm relieved you're not angry with me for being so presumptuous, he said as they ran up the stairs. They slowed to a walk as they crossed the lawn and took the pathway towards his front door. It's open, he said, motioning for her to go inside. Welcome to my humble abode. I feel like Rapunzel, she giggled, as he poured them both a drink and showed her the way up to the roof terrace. Well, I hope no one comes here to rescue you from this particular tower, he teased, handing her a drink. I want you all to myself tonight. She pretended to peek around, looking for something. No more nosy neighbours lurking anywhere, then? Better not be, he said. They sat down on the bench, and Gabriel put one arm around Daisy's shoulders. I've imagined you sitting up here with me many times, he said. I've imagined being with you too, she admitted. But it never occurred to me to picture us on top of a granite tower staring out to sea like this. He bent down and kissed her. I'm glad you came to work at the Encore. So am I. They leant back and slowly drank from their glasses, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. Remember getting up really early and going to the riverbank to sit and watch the boats go by? He asked eventually. She didn't like to admit that she thought about it far more than was probably good for her. She nodded. I do. She shivered involuntarily, and he mistook her reaction for the coolness of the evening. It's amazing how the temperature drops here when the sun goes in, he said. Daisy nodded. Shall we go inside? It's more comfortable there anyway. Okay. She let him take her glass so that she could climb back down the ladder to his room below. Somehow he managed to hold both glasses while following her down. I also recall being on that train journey when you insisted we could fit in the same bunk together, she giggled. I had a bruise on my hips for weeks from when I fell out. He winced. Yes, I still feel guilty about not catching you that night. He glanced down at her hip. Is it all right now? He asked, touching it lightly with the side of his finger, a glint in his dark eyes. She put her hands on her hips and tilted her head to one side. If it isn't, then I've got a problem. They stared at each other in silence for a few seconds, and Daisy wasn't sure where to look, especially as his double bed, covered with its stark white sheets, seemed like some sort of beacon. Would you rather we go downstairs? He asked. She thought about his offer, and realizing that she'd waited for almost 2 years for this moment, shook her head. He seemed surprised by her reaction. Then, placing the glasses on his bedside table, he sat down on the bed. She stared at him, not quite knowing what to do next. He leaned towards her on the white sheets. Are you going to join me? His eyes narrowed slightly. If you'd rather not stay in the tower with me tonight, I can always ask Nan if you can sleep in one of her spare rooms. She wouldn't mind. Would you? What, mind? He shrugged one shoulder. Of course not. I want you to be comfortable with me. She couldn't help feeling a little disappointed by his answer. He smiled, and his dark brown eyes twinkled mischievously. But if you mean, would I mind not making love to you tonight, I can't lie. I'd mind very much. I've waited a long time to lie next to your beautiful body. She wasn't going to hold back from him any longer. Hadn't he proved how much he wanted to be with her? Hadn't he done all that she'd asked? She couldn't help smiling as she stepped forward and onto the bed next to him. Gabriel smiled a long, lazy smile. Hello again, he said when she lay down. He bent down so his lips connected with hers in a kiss that was so perfect she never wanted it to end. I've missed you so much, he said, kissing her neck, moving down to her breasts and then her stomach. Daisy gasped and covered her mouth with one hand. She didn't want to distract him. This was too delicious. He peeked up at her. You're so beautiful, he murmured as he moved lower. But these need to come off. He undid the fastening on the side of her skirt. "Lift your hips," he murmured. She did as he asked. He slipped her skirt down past her thighs and dropped it on the floor, leaving her in her knickers. "These two?" he asked, that familiar twinkle in his dark eyes. She nodded. "Go on then," she said, barely able to force the words from her mouth as she looked down at his broad shoulders. He kissed the insides of her thighs and slowly inched higher, each step causing her to catch her breath in delight. His tongue began doing things to her that she remembered from their time away, and Daisy was beginning to think that she couldn't take much more when Gabriel looked up at her and smiled. Kissing his way back up her stomach, then her breasts, he smiled at her. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes," she replied impatiently. Gabriel finally entered her, kissing her as he did so. Daisy didn't want to close her eyes. She'd imagined this moment so many times. Watching his beautiful face as they made love was like living a dream. Unable to think clearly, she closed her eyes, climaxing just before he did. Gabriel whispered something she couldn't hear, holding her to him, as her mind splintered, and she knew nothing could ever be this perfect again. Daisy woke slowly the following morning. "I love you," she heard him say, so quietly she wasn't sure she'd dreamt it. She opened her eyes and stared through the small window at the rolling waves as they hit the sandy beach. Had she imagined those words? She squeezed her eyes shut, willing her memories of the previous night to be real. She'd dreamt so many times of hearing him saying exactly what she'd just heard, or thought she'd heard. "Did you hear me?" he whispered, kissing her bare shoulder. "I'm not sure," she teased. "What did you say?" "I said, I love you." She turned to face him and snuggled up against his chest, loving him more at that moment than she could ever have thought possible. "I love you too." His hand glided down over the small of her back, stopping at her bottom. "You're my very own Jersey Bombshell," he laughed, his eyes soft with love. She pushed him onto his back and sat astride him. "Say it again." That is the end of Coming Home to the Sunflower Cliffs, written by Georgina Troy and read by Gloria Sanders. Recorded by Isis Audio 2024. This has been a presentation for Boldwood. Chapter 2. Daisy. It was hard to know what to wear for dinner. Daisy wanted to be respectful and dress smartly, but at the same time she didn't want Gabe to think she was trying too hard. Seeing him again was bittersweet. She hoped his initial cheerful reaction to seeing her continued, though he had every right to be angry with the way she'd left things between them. Trying to remain positive, she took a quick shower and stared at the floral cotton dress she'd decided to wear. Wrapping her arms around herself, she thought back to Gabe holding her, if only briefly, back in reception. She couldn't deny it had felt good. "Gabe," she whispered, sitting down at the fitted dressing table and pulling a brush through her damp hair. She stared into space, remembering meeting him in Vietnam on a sun terrace in Ho Chi Minh City. She'd taken a seat at his small metal table because it was the only one available. He'd been laughing when she sat down. "What's so funny?" she asked, trying her best to sound self-assured after taking a sip of her drink. She couldn't help noticing how good-looking he was, but knew her lack of confidence meant that if there had been any other seats free, she'd have rather taken one of those, instead of trying to make small talk with this intimidating stranger. "I've just messaged my dad to say where I am, and he was shocked," he said.
I know the Vietnam War ended back in the 70s, but in my dad's mind, this is still a dangerous place. A war zone, even. He was quite concerned to think I was in Saigon, as it was back then. Daisy understood his father's reaction. My mum said the same when I told her I planned to visit here. She said she remembers her parents listening daily to the news bulletins about the dreadful losses. They gazed down at the busy streets and cheerful faces around them. It's hard to imagine the chaos happening here back when the city fell, isn't it? He asked, staring at her. It is. She recalled a documentary she'd seen recently of grainy film showing an Air America helicopter resting on the top of a building, with people crowding up a roof ladder, trying desperately to reach it. That hot evening in the bar had been the first of many evenings spent in each other's company. She'd readily agreed when Gabriel suggested she'd travel with him to see a few towns on their way to Hoi An, where they'd both planned to stay for a while. By the time they reached their destination, they were besotted with each other. But, unfortunately, her mother's health had taken a nasty turn, and she had to hurriedly return to England. Everything had disintegrated after that. Now, though, seeing him back here and giving up all that he loved to assist his family, she could see he'd meant it when he'd told her, "Family is the most important thing you'll ever have, Daisy. If you need to go to your mom, then we'll just have to deal with it. We'll make a plan to meet up again when she's settled." She'd reluctantly agreed with him, but things hadn't turned out as either of them initially hoped. The landline in her room rang, making her jump. She glanced at her bedside clock and saw she was late to meet him downstairs. Picking up the phone, she heard Fee's stammering attempt at professionalism and could tell Gabe must be standing in front of her. "Thanks, Fee," she said. "Please tell Gabriel I'm on my way." It seemed odd referring to him by his full name. She pushed the thought aside and hurriedly dressed, picking up her bag with one hand and running the other through her long, wavy, fair hair. She hoped it would be dry by the time they arrived at Lydia's house. She pushed open the door leading from the staff quarters to the reception area and hesitated when she saw him leaning against the counter, laughing at something Fee was saying. He looked so relaxed and at home here. As he should do, she thought. But it was still strange seeing someone she associated so much with her travels and the heady colours and scents of Asia, standing at her workplace in Jersey. He looked up and, seeing her at the doorway, held up a set of car keys. "I've got transport and have been instructed not to dawdle, so we'd better get a move on." He waited for her to reach him, then smiled at Fee. "It's great to see you again, Fee," he said. "Tell that brother of yours that I'll take him up on his offer to go kayaking with him and his mate Ed one of these days." "Will do," Fee said, winking slyly at Daisy as soon as Gabe turned his back to hold the door open for her. "Have fun," she mouthed. Daisy pulled a face at her and followed him to the red sports car. "Wow, you must be special to Mrs. Gray if she allows you to drive her car," she teased as she got in, happy that the roof was down and her hair would have a chance to dry during their drive. Gabriel took his seat in the car next to her and started it. He put the car into gear and turned to her, smiling. "It's not hers, it's mine." "You're looking very lovely," he said. "Your hair's grown a lot." "Thank you. It probably needs a trim, but I haven't got round to finding a hairdresser in Jersey yet." "It's small, but there's a lot to discover here," he said, steering the car down the driveway. Checking nothing was coming, he pulled out onto the main road. "Does it feel strange seeing me here?" She was relieved she wasn't the only one experiencing that surreal sensation. "Yes, very." He drove in silence for a couple of minutes. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but How come you ended up working at the Encore? Gabe had never been one to hold back from facing anything awkward, so his question didn't surprise her. I'd never been here before, and after... She hesitated, not ready to share her story with him. Well, after I'd decided to leave Devon, I remembered you mentioning how beautiful it was here. I needed somewhere to work and have experience working as a receptionist in a hotel back home. The Encore provided me with a job and somewhere to live. I can tell by the look on your face when I arrived at the hotel that you didn't know it was run by my family. He studied her face briefly, then turning back to focus on the road ahead, added, You wouldn't have come to the Encore if you'd known I was connected to it, would you? No, she said honestly. Then I'm glad you didn't know, he said, turning the car into a small lane. Why didn't you answer any of my messages? As soon as she'd seen him standing outside the hotel, Daisy knew he would ask her this question. It didn't help her come up with an acceptable answer for him, though, and she certainly wasn't ready to tell him about her issues with Aaron. I'm not sure what to say, really, she said, racking her brains to come up with something that didn't divulge her true story. It's okay, he said, giving her one of his smiles she remembered only too well. I understand if you've moved on. It was 2 years ago, after all. But our time away together was pretty amazing. It was, she said wistfully. But our lives were going in opposite directions. She hoped he wasn't going to question her too much, although he had every right to expect a few answers. She recalled the promises they'd made to each other to stay in touch and meet up again as soon as they could manage to. But she'd left him in Hoi An and believed their relationship to be a beautiful memory from her past. So, what have you been doing since I last saw you? I mean, after you returned home to Devon. You seemed so happy in Vietnam. It was hard to imagine you staying back in England. It wasn't easy, she said truthfully. But I haven't been doing much, she fibbed. I've been here in Jersey since April to help set up for the season, and I'm loving it. Your grandmother is incredible, she said, hoping to divert his attention away from her. I really like her. She is, he nodded. I spent a huge amount of my childhood staying with her. Was that because Francesca and Rick were away working? Yes. You never told me your family had a hotel, she said, trying not to sound accusatory. I never connected you with Francesca and Rick. You said your last name was Wilson. It is, he laughed. It's a little complicated. You see, my dad's real surname is Wilson, but there was another Rick Wilson with an equity card, so he uses my mother's maiden name of Malone. Mum uses her maiden name Fiore. Nan used to be an actress back in the 50s, and she reverted to her maiden name Gray, the one she used for her acting career after she split up with her husband. Daisy followed what he was telling her until he reached the bit about Lydia. I never knew your grandmother was an actress too. He gave her a wide smile. You didn't realize she was the Lydia Gray? 50s blonde bombshell and Jersey's answer to Marilyn Monroe. Daisy laughed at his teasing. My mum was a huge fan of hers and had all her films. She conjured up a picture of the actress at the height of her fame. He wasn't joking. His grandmother was the Lydia Gray. How did I not realize that before? I love her work. She stared at him, trying to recall what had happened to end Lydia's career at the height of her success. But she disappeared suddenly after only a few years. What on earth happened? Gabe slowed the car to turn into a long driveway. He sighed. It's a bit of a mystery, I'm afraid, and one she refuses to discuss, he said. She fell in love with my grandfather, but things didn't work out. That much I do know. She has said that I look very much like him. Daisy wished she could see a picture of Gabe's mysterious grandfather, and hoped she'd be able to find out more about Lydia's past. She recalled her mother talking about the actress's disappearance from the public eye, and much had been speculated about it. At least she knew Lydia was okay now. It's exciting to finally have met her, she said eventually. He shrugged. She's always seemed happy. I think whatever did happen was life-changing. Her marriage didn't last all that long, but she's never encouraged any of us to ask about it. Always changing the subject if we do get a little curious. Daisy opened her mouth to ask him what Lydia had done next, but he parked the car and got out, holding her door open for her. She'll be waiting for us around the back on the terrace. They hurried round along the stone pathway, and Gabriel raised his hand and waved at his grandmother sitting at a table. Her step faltered as she was confronted by the exquisite view in front of her. She presumed Lydia's home had been built sometime in the 50s, and the garden, which looked as if it led straight out onto a beach, was awe-inspiring. "See, I told you I'd get her here safely," Gabriel called. She hurried to catch up with him. She straightened her dress and tried to tidy up her unruly hair before greeting her hostess. "Hello, Mrs. Gray," she said, looking around her at the perfectly manicured lawn that dipped gently towards a view of the bay, framed on two sides by two enormous pine trees. What a spectacular view! Lydia stood up and gave Gabriel a hug, then motioned for Daisy to take a seat at the table. "I'm glad you like it." She stared out to the rolling waves on the Navy Sea out in the bay. "I've lived here for decades, and still think I must be dreaming for the first few seconds that I'm awake." "I can see why," Daisy said, imagining how idyllic it would be to wake up at this house every morning, surrounded by the vivid colours from the garden, and going to sleep with the sounds of the waves all around. "Darling, go and pour Daisy a Bellini and get yourself a cool drink." She turned her attention back to Daisy. "I hope you like them. I make excellent Bellinis, so I'm told." She thought she spotted a hint of sadness in Lydia's eyes. "I love them," Daisy said. Gabe was soon back with her drink, which was delicious. "Good?" Gabriel asked. "Nan only uses the best white peach juice," he said. "She insists that's the difference between a perfect Bellini and an average one, don't you, Nan?" "It's heavenly," Daisy said, before taking another sip. "I'm glad you like it, Daisy," Lydia said, raising her glass to them. "So," Gabriel said, "what are you treating us to for dinner tonight?" He leant forward slightly, and in a mock whisper to Daisy said, "Nan is an excellent cook and likes to try out different recipes, so be prepared." Daisy laughed. "You look perfectly healthy on Mrs. Gray's cooking," she teased. "Please call me Lydia," she said. "Being called Mrs. Gray in my home is making me feel old." She rested a hand on Daisy's forearm. "I don't do all the cooking. I have Anna. She's my housekeeper and cooks for me, as well as keeping everything in order. I mainly potter around my garden and take long walks on the beach." She laughed. "Gabriel doesn't enjoy much of my cooking. He wasn't impressed with the chocolate chili sauce I concocted the last time he was staying." Daisy wasn't surprised. She hoped she wasn't being treated to a similar combination. "Oh?" Gabriel laughed. "I think Daisy is a bit more of a traditionalist when it comes to food, Nan." "Not necessarily," Daisy said, not wishing to offend Lydia. "You like the idea of chocolate and chili in a dish?" Lydia asked. "I can't help thinking of it as rather an unnecessary combination." Daisy couldn't help smiling. "No," she said. "I have to admit, I didn't like it much either," Lydia laughed. "But it was worth a try. I haven't made anything too unfamiliar for us tonight, though." Daisy smiled, then sat back in the cushioned metal chair and looked out across the well-kept garden to the sea once again. "It's very peaceful here, isn't it?" Lydia nodded. "It can be a little too peaceful when Gabriel is away. Sometimes, in the summer, I rent out rooms to Francesca and Rick's acting friends who've come over on tour to the Arts Trust or the Opera House. I like the company, and it's good to talk to new people in the business." Daisy was delighted Lydia had brought up the subject of acting. "Gabriel and I were only just discussing your fascinating career on the way here in the car," she said. "I grew up looking at books on film and actors that my mum collected. There were loads of pictures of you." She hesitated before adding, "Do you miss that life at all?" Lydia took a sip of her drink and stared at her thoughtfully before answering. "Sometimes." She placed her drink back down on the table. "I'm far too old for all that now, but I loved it when I was filming, and even the initial struggle to be discovered." "I think my mum dreamed of being an actress, and when she didn't realise her dream, she tried to encourage me to act," Daisy admitted. "It wasn't something she'd shared with anyone else. She made me go to dance and acting lessons and even took extra jobs to pay for them all." "What happened?" Gabriel asked, resting back in his chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. Daisy smiled at the memory. "I was hopeless and so shy. The last thing I wanted to do was perform in front of anyone. I hated the lessons." She thought back to that first time in the class with 20 other children, all of whom seemed to love what they were doing. "We had to be ants wading through honey or something. I didn't see the point and would have much rather been out with my best friend riding her pony." "I don't blame you," Gabriel laughed. "I was always in a swimming pool." Lydia turned her attention to her grandson. "I remember when your father was certain you had the voice of an angel and should audition for one of those church choirs on the mainland." Gabriel nodded. "Until Mum told him that if I was going to be an entertainer, I should be an actor. That was when I decided to go into something far removed from their business." "Marine exploration?" Daisy asked. "That's quite a different route to go down on the career front." Lydia got up. "He was in the water at every opportunity, this boy." She rested a hand on Gabriel's shoulder. "I'll go inside and sort out the food and leave you two here to chat for a few minutes." "Call me when you want me to come and carry out the plates," Gabriel said before turning his attention back to Daisy. "Nan doesn't often talk about her acting, you know. I think she misses it more than she lets on. I also believe it's why she's always been so supportive of Mum and Dad, by taking over at the hotel and looking after me so they could take on work." Daisy wondered how it must feel to have someone willing to do that whenever you needed them to. She envied Francesca and Rick their freedom. "She's a wonderful lady." He looked towards the doorway through which his grandmother had just walked. "She is. I'm very lucky to have her." "It must have been wonderful to spend so much time here when you were growing up." "Yes, I always loved it. Nan is very relaxed and great fun to be with. If I'm honest, I used to look forward to my parents going away. They were always happier to be doing something they loved, and Nan was pleased to have me here with her." "How about you? What was your childhood like?" Daisy thought back to lonely days in Devon with her mum working long hours, trying to make enough for them to live on, and the occasional visits from her father. She'd learnt from experience that lies hurt. Her mother had been let down by him before she was born, and despite him running away, then coming back after Daisy's birth, insisting he wanted to make a go of their relationship, her mother had been so hurt by his initial cowardice that she'd said no. He'd gone off and married another woman within months, and her mother had never got over losing him. Daisy recalled the humiliation of only being allowed to see her father when his family didn't expect him to be around. She hated that she was his secret child, despite her mother trying to make her accept that being a love child was in some way romantic. It wasn't. She refused to be anyone's second best ever again. When she'd grown into a teenager, her dream had been for her art to be good enough to hold her own exhibition, and that ambition had been on the point of realization until Aaron had made life so impossible for her that she'd had to leave everything behind at barely a moment's notice. "I lived in a pretty village near the sea," she said finally, not wishing him to know the full extent of her story. "So I spent most of my time on the beach, or wandering around the cliff paths, finding places to sketch or paint." "Do you still paint?" "Sometimes," she said, not wishing to think about how much she missed those days. There was a brief silence before Gabe asked, "Do you think that's where you got your travel bug?" "Maybe. There were always so many holiday makers around, and I always wondered where they'd come from." Gabe stared at her in silence for a bit. "How come we spent so much time together in Vietnam and never talked about our pasts? What did we talk about?" She shook her head, allowing herself to think back to those perfect weeks where she'd been happiest. "Probably the places we'd been to and what we'd seen." She had spent 2 years trying not to think too much about those blissful days and nights with him. "I should think Jersey and Devon were farthest from our minds when we were so far away." He nodded. "Yes, you're probably right. And art, of course." Daisy smiled. Gabe had been a keen sketcher in Vietnam, and they'd had many conversations about it, and about how the light was different there to at home, making the colours of the earth and sky seem more vibrant somehow. She twisted the ring on her finger. "You kept it, then?" She frowned, unsure what he meant. Then, following his line of vision, realised he was referring to the interlaced triple rings he'd bought her at a tiny jewellery shop they'd come across during the last week of their time together. The ring with its yellow, gold and white bands. "Oh, yes, I wear it all the time." She didn't add that it comforted her when she was feeling especially vulnerable. The thought made her glance down the garden towards the beach. She was being silly. She was safe here. No one knew her, so who could let him know where to find her? "I'm pleased," Gabe said, bringing her back to the present. He frowned. "You okay?" She forced a smile. "Yes, I was just thinking." "You looked troubled for a moment," he said. "Are you sure there's nothing bothering you?" "Nothing," she lied. Aaron had ruined far too much of her life already. She was determined to overcome her fear of him, somehow. She really must learn to hide her feelings if she didn't want anyone to start questioning her about her past, she decided. If she was going to make a new life for herself, then she needed to push aside her memories of Aaron and what he'd done to her. He'd ruined her life in Devon, but she had a chance to make a life for herself here in Jersey. She placed her hand on the table, letting the sun glint on her ring. "I didn't think there was a reason to take it off," she said, awkwardly bringing the subject back to happier memories. "It's a beautiful ring." "I'm glad you like it. I wasn't sure if you were just being polite when I bought it for you. But when you told me you had to leave, it seemed the perfect sentiment." She stared at the 3 intertwined bands. They met. They fell in love. They parted, she said, thinking how sad they'd both been when she discovered she had to cut her trip short. He raised his glass. Come on, let's not think about the past. Nan will go mad if she thinks I ruined your evening. We're here to enjoy her food. He laughed. I hope. Relieved he'd lightened the mood, Daisy joined him. She was enjoying herself, not only because of seeing him again, but also for the chance to get to know Lydia a bit better, and spend an evening away from the hotel and the constant noise that went with living on site. Gabriel, can you come and help me, please? Lydia shouted from inside the house. He gave Daisy a smile and got up. It's good to have you here, he said simply, before walking off to help his grandmother. Daisy breathed in the rose-scented air in the pretty garden. She didn't think she'd ever spent time in any private garden as beautiful as this one. She looked at the herb border and longed to smell a sprig of the abundant rosemary growing along the back. She would love to paint it sometime. Here we are, Gabriel said, placing a plate of penne pasta in front of her and another on his grandmother's place. He took the plate his grandmother was holding for himself. I'll go and fetch the salad and bread. It's arrabbiata, Lydia said. I hope you like it. Daisy did. In fact, she thoroughly enjoyed the entire evening with one old friend and another newer one. Lydia asked Gabriel more about his latest project, and Daisy could see how proud Lydia was of her grandson from the sparkle in her eyes. I love it, but it's very intense, which is why I can't afford to be here for too long, he said between mouthfuls. I need to get back to the others and do my bit as soon as possible. We're hoping for approval from a new sponsor to keep the project going. Where is it? Daisy asked. And what does the project involve? It's in South Africa, down the south coast from Durban.